Oh, this is easy. This is easy.
Easiest,
yes.
easiest.
Welcome back to On Deadline, the Washington Examiner's political game show. I'm Christian Daytalk.
And I'm Tiana Lodesher.
Each week we bring you the biggest news in politics, deliver our takes, and then you get to vote on a winner at the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with all your friends and family. We're starting like we always do, above the fold, where we each both get a minute to talk about the biggest story on our radar. What's that for you today, Tiana?
Last week, the New York Times reported that after months of deliberation, Donald Trump rejected a proposal from the Israelis that the U.S. would help them in a strike on Iran's nuclear armament. Now, the fact that this happened is not that big of a deal, right? Like Trump's eventual decision or love it, Donald Trump has that right to deliberate. And apparently there were internal debates in the White House, with Trump ending up going with this path of trying to pursue a second Iran deal that doesn't seem all that different from the first Iran deal, but I digress. Here's the real issue, though. Why was that story made public at all? Why was it gone through the fake news New York Times that he hates to burn the Israeli government, one of our close intelligence assets, in order to give the Iranians a warning? Fast forward a couple weeks later, and you have a number of senior Defense Department officials being frog-marked out of the Pentagon. Because why? Of suspected leaking. This comes after Tucker Carlson, for some reason, was telegraphing the idea that not only would a strike on Iran lead us to war, but that the U.S. would lose that war. What's the conclusion here, Christian? I think it's that there is a deep state undermining the president. But it's not the deep state everyone assumes it is. It is the deep state that wants to appease Tehran and have us back away as the world superpower.
You know, Tiana, I am not surprised to see the political apparatus working to either directly undermine Trump's policies or perhaps gum up the rollout that these behind-the-scenes negotiations usually afford an administration. So my question is to you this. The White House, not on the Iran story itself, but on this secondary signal scandal that Secretary Hegseth is wrapped up in, they're backing him up. So, are they just going to allow this to continue? We saw Anthony Scaramucci come in during the first term, a whirlwind 11 days as communications director, and he basically shut off the majority of those White House leaks. What's next for this version of the Trump White House?
And look, there's a massive difference between a leak in general, right? If you're leaking about the tax bill or deportations or versus burning a crucial intelligence source. And remember, this is the second time that a leak, if we want to count Signalgate as a leak, has burned Israeli intelligence. And it's pretty clear that, look, I don't understand some of this more isolationist faction, if only within the White House when it comes to this defense position, if only because it's shockingly similar to the Obama administration, right? We saw these sorts of leaks all the time, burning Israel to help out Tehran. But the idea that we want to have, spheres of influence, or we just let Russia control their own sphere of influence, how is that any different than Obama and his, it's a multipolar world. We're not the world's policemen. We can't be anymore. Like we're doing an Iran deal, we're burning the Israelis. How is this different than Obama's second term?
I think you need to go back further in time. I don't think this sounds like President Obama's foreign policy. When you talk about spheres of influence, the first thing I hear or think about is 19th century and 20th century colonization policies of England or France or the Netherlands and China and other parts of Southeast Asia. Trump wants to go back to, the 20th century, late 19th century tariff proposals. Maybe he's trying to do the same thing on foreign policy.
Which, honestly, I understand not wanting other countries to screw us. I think other NATO countries clearly need to pay their fair share. But the end goal should be strengthening these alliances. The end goal should be the U.S. having greater control of the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency, setting boundaries, not backing away from the rest of the world. Because look, it's a naive view of politics to think that we're allowed to leave a power vacuum behind, and the worst people in the world, the North Koreans and the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese, would immediately leap to fill that in. Christian, what's the top story you're following?
Well, last year, and I know this feels like a lifetime ago, but Project 2025 was talked about by everyone on the campaign trail. Democrats tried to say that this is an authoritarian playbook that Donald Trump can use to upend American society and the federal government, while Trump himself said, no, that's the Heritage Foundation. I had nothing to do with it. And now, nearly 100 days into Trump's term in office, the answer isn't quite so clear on who was right about this policy mandate. Of the 130 executive actions Trump has taken since January, the bulk of them certainly appear copy and pasted from that 900-page book. I'm talking things like rolling back federal DEI programs, barring trans athletes from competing in women's sports, the whole deportation agenda, tearing down the Department of Education, and of course, taking a chainsaw to the federal workforce. But there's a number of huge provisions within Project 2025 that Trump is taking the opposite path. Think about tax reform. Project 2025 wanted to simplify the tax code, and Donald Trump is certainly not doing that. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if Trump is working off the Project 2025 playbook because we've seen the negative impacts his policies have had on the economy, which really, we know, runs politics.
And that always should have been, like, I understand that 2024 was just such a weird fever dream because of everything that happened with Joe Biden melting down, Kamala Harris becoming the nominee without a single public vote. Like, so obviously it left Democrats and the entire media apparatus around it, like, sort of searching, how do you even fight this, defend this? There were so many moving parts that garnered way more attention. And now I can totally say in retrospect, I was not fear-mongering enough about the tariff proposals, right? Obviously, Trump has gone above and beyond what he ever proposed. It was the most extreme example he proposed was the 10% universal tariff. And we know that will have incredibly distortionary effects, not just on, you know, direct imports and the direct lived economy, but also, as we'll get more into, the bond market and how we finance our national debt. We're already seeing the immediate ramifications of that. But the odd thing with Project 2025 is it was, in essence, an ego project for Kevin Roberts, the new Heritage Foundation president, who, like, ironically, as Heritage became this national boogeyman, made the Heritage Foundation in DC command less respect and less influence than it ever has in its 50 years, right? And you can see that in the text of Project 2025. It's a Frankenstein's monster of various contributors. And, like, so for instance, there's a portion on baby formula that was written by the CEO of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a massively, like, libertarian institute. And so that chapter, which is quite good, correctly points out we have 15 to 17% tariffs on baby formula imports. And as we saw in, like, that 2022 baby formula shortage that really harmed a lot of parents, especially moms, and he was proposing, you know, deregulating the industry, making it easier so we just have the same standards as the Europeans. Compare that to what RFK Jr. is doing at HHS, where he's simultaneously saying, we're going to have Operation Stork Speed, where we're going to massively crack down on baby formula, and also we're firing 6 workers in the FDA's Division of Food Processing Science that is specifically responsible for making sure that baby formula is safe. So, like, be careful what you wish for, libs, because we might have been better off if they had stuck to some of the Project 2025 suggestions.
Yeah.
Because this is not it.
I think this whole exercise has sort of shown me that Democrats made a major strategic choice last year. They tried to campaign against a hypothetical policy plan, which, for the record, Heritage puts this out every general election cycle.
It's just called the Mandate for Leadership. This time was only weird because they did it before the election.
Correct. And, like, Donald Trump, the Democrats would have been better served campaigning off exactly what Donald Trump says. And to your point, you should have fear-mongered about the tariffs more. They should have said, over the last 10 years, Donald Trump has proven, even the crazy stuff he says, he's going to try to work on. So why do we need to project on something else? And I understand that the abortion, component of this was a major, driving force behind, we need to animate the vote. We need to get similar turnout to like we did in the midterm elections, where the Dobbs decision clearly had an impact on that cycle.
But who is your average midterm voter versus your median general election voter, right? The midterm voters tend to be these higher propensity, higher educated voters who can have, I mean, let's be real, abortion to a large extent, it's a luxury belief to have heavy salience for that issue. Like, I'm not saying, like, of course, I'm pro-life. And, like, and so I like pro-life candidates. But if that is your number one issue, either in favor or against, that's a luxury belief. Most voters cannot afford to care more about climate change or abortion than they can about inflation and employment.
Pun intended. voters can't afford to think about anything other than the economy.
Now it's time for Yays and Nays, when we give our opinion on the news of the week. Sometimes we'll agree, other times we'll disagree.
Trump would regret firing Jerome Powell.
Oh, this is easy. This is easy.
Easiest.
I know you're going to go ham on the specific machinations of how the Fed Reserve works. So all I want to say is this. So far, the Federal Reserve has been one of the only independent organizations that's been able to stand up to Trump, through weeks of Truth Social posts about the president saying, too late, Powell, that's his nickname for him, which not one of his best. But he needs to lower rates because, doing so will help unshackle economic growth that my policies are bringing in. Look, the resistance needs someone to rally behind. They're kind of flirting with AOC, but she's touring across the country right now. Jerome Powell is literally controlling the levers which, allow the American economy to stay afloat. Pushing him out is going to cause significant uproar against the folks who are automatically inclined to hate everything you do. This is a losing scenario. And again, even if he does lower rates, I'm not an expert like you are, I don't think it's going to play out in combination with his tariff agenda the way he wants it to. It could lead the country directly, skip the recession and go directly into a depression. Am I wrong on that?
Oh, no, not at all. So of all the quote-unquote independent agencies, independent bodies that are not, or three major branches of government, the Federal Reserve is probably the best positioned, both in terms of legally how it was designed and how the Supreme Court has continued to have respect for its independence, and in terms of the members of the body doing a good job of maintaining, the appearance of independence.
Yeah.
Unlike CFPB and a bunch of these other, even let's say like the FBI, the Federal Reserve has done a very good job where when you had cases like during the Obama administration of they tried to appoint Jamie Raskin's wife to the FOMC, and that correctly got shot down because she had said the job of the Federal Reserve should also include climate change. And the Fed has been, although they have had a little bit of wokery, at the end of the day, they've done a very good job saying we are balancing full employment with price stability. So inflation versus limiting unemployment.
Yeah.
Now, removing Jerome Powell, practically speaking, so there are 12 members of the FOMC. This is the meeting where I think it's 9 times a year, they coalesce and they decide either we're increasing the federal funds rate, decreasing it, or holding it. You have 12 votes. Oh, in this decade, so since the start of 2020, we've had almost, 40 meetings, or almost 50 meetings, and 12 votes at each meeting, roughly. Only 8 total dissenting votes. So dissent is not common.
Yeah.
So practically, we'll get to like the broader implications, but practically speaking, if Trump fired Jerome Powell, and let's say there was like a next Fed meeting and Jerome Powell wasn't there, then the acting chair is Vice Chair Philip Jefferson, who is a Biden appointee, arguably more liberal. But again, the Fed, for better or for worse, does try to vote in a quorum. Like dissent is not incredibly common, and it's a very functionally conservative body. Mm-hmm. That's bad when you have a situation like Biden inflation, where they kind of all can convince each other, oh no, we need to keep rates low because this is all just transitory inflation. But then there are cases like right now where give us a few more good months. We've had 2 good months for inflation. Let's see what the result of the tariffs are this month. And if we get 2 more good months of inflation, then maybe get a rate hike.
Show a real trend, right?
But if they get terrorized into doing this, worse, if the markets perceive that the Fed is responding to public incentives from Trump, political incentives from Trump, that is when you see market Armageddon. Not just in the stock market, not just in the bond market, but also in the value of the US dollar itself.
That's the biggie.
Because what it means is, and let's be clear, although there historically has been a pretty tight one-to-one relationship between the federal funds rate and those treasury bond interest rates, interest yields, that relationship has really diverged over the last year because there was that period of time at the end of last year where Powell was slashing the federal funds rate. That's just the overnight lending rate. So what one bank has to get from another bank to borrow, or borrowing from a local Federal Reserve, right? That is not the same thing as the rate that bond buyers want in return for their investment. That is different.
Yeah. This is Trump shooting himself in the other foot because he's trying to pressure Congress to, pass through all these tax cuts, get to the litany of legislative matters that he hasn't been able to take up, either because of the backlog on nominations or because of, they have to address the budgetary matters first. But this would just add a whole nother confirmation process, a highly viewed and highly controversial confirmation process because of how Powell would have been removed. That's just going to eat into Donald Trump's time to get anything done before the midterm elections. And then after the midterm elections, we know no Democrat is going to reach across the aisle to help him ahead of the general. It just seems like it shrinks his window. But I'm not surprised he's thinking about doing it. He's a crazy person.
This is so not a fight that anyone needed or wants.
Exactly, yeah.
And if anything, the tariffs we know will be slightly inflationary. And this is one of the reasons why tariffs are dangerous forms of taxation, because taxation in general, otherwise, while it limits growth, it tends to limit inflation.
Yeah.
Tariffs increase inflation while also limiting growth.
Double whammy.
So there's not a strong case for reducing interest rates by any objective measure. But, give it a few months. Let's just... did anyone vote for this, Christian? I don't like...
I definitely did not. Anyway, it's time for us to fill in the blank.
Raising the corporate tax rate to pay for the one big beautiful bill would blank.
Ooh, this is fun.
It's a big blank, and it's one that, for all of our Washington Examiner viewers at home, if you didn't see last week, our own Christian Day Talk made sure to press the White House on whether or not this was actually a possibility.
Can you explain why the president opted to send Secretary Hegseth to the dignified transfer last week instead of attending himself?
Sure. The Secretary Hegseth was there to represent the administration. The president has expressed his condolences to these families, as have I from this podium.
That definitely doesn't sound like a no from the White House, right?
No, it does not.
Yeah.
And that's the big headline here. And I would like to warn the White House that raising the corporate tax rate to pay for the one big beautiful bill would make it dead on arrival.
Yeah.
Seriously, it's DOA politically, economically, in all senses.
Mm-hmm.
Broadly speaking, what is Trump trying to do here with these tariffs? If he is saying the tariffs are supposed to both be a revenue raiser and we want to bring back more domestic manufacturing and more businesses that have, onshore more business, then the number one thing you would want to do is reduce the corporate tax rate and also include in, expensing, which has been a big conversation. The last thing you would do is touch the corporate tax rate, which Trump term one under the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was made permanent. That cut from the 35% top rate to the 21% flat corporate tax rate, that was made permanent. The fact that they're even bringing that into this bill, opening up Pandora's box, we won't find hope in the bottom of that box. We will find an election slaughter in the midterms.
I'm glad you brought up TCJA because you are right. This is not only a rescission of Trump's campaign promise from last year to lower the corporate tax rate again from 21% to 15%.
Yeah.
He's doing the opposite. He's saying, I'm undoing my old policies, which folks on both sides of the aisle liked because they were pro-growth. What this shows is that Trump has literally zero ideological convictions this time around. He is wholly consumed with being president, but he does not want to actually do president and implement a cohesive, consistent agenda, right? It's not just in economic policy. Look at what he's doing with Iran, which we've already talked about earlier today. During his first term, he withdrew from JCPOA. He launched a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, which included, really crippling economic sanctions on top of heavy military attacks on these proxy groups throughout the Middle East. And now he's just saying, we're going to, I'm going to be a pen pal with the Ayatollah. And we're going to solve.
They're literally trying to assassinate you, right now.
Yeah.
They have a fatwa out for you, President Trump. Please don't empower people that want to kill you.
What this development shows is that everyone who voted for Donald Trump should be concerned that he not only is not going to do what he said he was going to do on the campaign trail, he's just kind of making it up as he goes. And I know they're doing this as a means of trying to win those budget hawks in the House to get on board with the tax plan. But like, at what cost? Are you sacrificing your own policies and ideals to get a deal done? Is that what, being the best deal maker in the country or in the world means these days? I don't know.
And we've mapped out why the TCJA extension is so important. So TCJA, at the end of this year, you have a number of individual and estate tax provisions that are expiring. But most significant is the fact that it winds up being that 62% of Americans wind up with a tax hike if the TCJA individual provisions expire.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, a huge part of that is just because that standard deduction was doubled, which also simplified taxes for a lot of Americans. Whereas instead of having to go and TurboTax and itemize every iota of whatever deduction you can find, you just take that standard deduction, making it really easy to file. Mm-hmm. Now, what would be worse than letting those 62% of Americans get somewhat of an individual tax hike would be reversing that corporate tax cut. Yeah. Because consider this. So since 2017, the corporate tax revenue as a share of GDP has increased by more than 40%. The total corporate tax revenue collected by the federal government has more than doubled. Why? Because taxes, it's not the higher the rate, the more money you get. Like, the Laffer curve does exist.
You have to incentivize investments and new opportunities and capital flowing into areas.
And the whole point was to make us more competitive with the rest of the developed world. So when you combine national and subnational corporate taxes, so that would be the federal corporate tax rate on top of the average state tax rates. Ours averages at almost 26%, but the OECD average is only 24%. So yes, the answer you would think is, let's cut that corporate tax rate if we're going to do the whole tariff thing to bring back more businesses. And frankly, maybe, I'm totally fine being Scrooge McDuck, but it's because I'm a long-term thinker. Long-term Americans, if the only two options were individual tax hike in the midterm election year of 2026 or permanently hampering American investment and how competitive we are for long-term economic growth in exchange for what? No tax on Social Security for boomers that we've already handed everything to anyway? I'm sorry. I'm going to have to take the personal tax hike. And the farce of it all is that those are not the only two options. We have a billion other ways to raise money to do this. And yet,
this is what we're working with. Anyway, that's all the time we've got for this week. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. And you can check out more of our great reporting at washingtonexaminer.com. I'm Christian Daytalk.
I'm Tiana Lodesher.
And we'll see you next time.